Hello and welcome to IKIKE Digest, your learning space on Home FTV. I am Kome Ojomo. On IKIKE Digest, we aim to continuously bring to light environmental issues as it affects communities in our food system. We highlight policy gaps that do not meet the needs of people and bring our listeners to speed with accurate environmental information. And today we will be looking at how communities respond to climate harm, responding to climate harm in rural communities. And we do know that climate change presents significant challenges to rural communities worldwide. These regions often rely heavily on agriculture, natural resources, and traditional livelihoods, making them particularly vulnerable to climate-related disruptions, such as extreme weather events, change in rainfall patterns, and rising temperatures. Responding effectively to these challenges requires comprehensive strategies that encompasses both response actions and long-term adaptation plan. Understanding how rural communities can build resilience and adopt sustainable solutions is crucial to protecting their well-being and promoting a sustainable development in the face of the ongoing climate impacts. To give us insight on how to respond to climate harm in rural community is Amara Nwankpa. Amara Nwankpa is an experienced civic technology and public policy expert committed to developing context-specific and evidence-based policies that align with complex social, political, and institutional dynamics shaping governance on the continent. You're welcome, Amara.
Thank you, Kome. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So I'm reading through your bio. I see that you have vast knowledge when it comes to public policies. Can you share some experience that this has brought to the table for you?
Well, I would like to first of all, lead with my perspective about public policy, because a lot of times when we envision public policy, we think of a direction, a collective direction that is set by the state. And in many parts of Africa and the post-colonial contexts, these are usually delivered in Western formal language. But I would like to say that the way I envision policy is being a statement of collective resolve and a collective roadmap towards a collectively identified goal or purpose. And when you look at it that way, the state doesn't have a monopoly when it comes to driving, defining, and implementing public policy. The unction and the drive for public policy can emerge from civic spaces. It can emerge from traditional or informal spaces as well. But what matters is that it reflects a collective disposition and it points towards a collective objective or a collective ambition. And when that is present, you find that that collective will identify resources, will agree on a collective strategy, and will cooperate, together to achieve that goal. Many times, what we miss in public policy in this context of the state, in places like Nigeria, is that you have that process of policy development and policy implementation divorced from the arenas that have control of the resources, control of the will, and that are locus of legitimacy and trust when it comes to that issue. And because of that, that policy is already swimming against the tide and therefore very difficult to implement. And so you have very good policies on paper, but in reality, they do not connect to the social institutions within society that can actually give what is passive, can animate it.
Okay, so let me jump into that policy part, because we're looking at responding to climate harm in rural communities, because we started with policies. What are some of these government policies or program Do you think there are any policy or program that do support rural communities in the challenge that they face when it comes to climate-related issues?
Well, I think Nigeria has a broad range of policy responses to what I would call environmental harm or environmental preventing or responding to environmental harm. Of course, there is the National Emergency Management Agency, which is a reactive agency when it comes to addressing national disasters. I think states also have their emergency management agencies as well. There's also watershed management that's under the Ministry of Environment that looks at how, for instance, Nigeria manages watersheds and prevention of floods and so on and so forth, but also managing the water runoff, managing things like erosion, but, land erosion and coastal erosion. So all of these are examples of national or institutional responses to these issues. But we also have to remember that the places where these issues occur are not voids. They are communities, they are places where governance is already happening and people are already doing things in a certain way. And many times those things, the way people do things in these areas have happened over time without state support. So there has been an absence of the state in many of these areas in terms of how these people govern natural resources, that is land, water, and so on. Or in many areas, it's actually even in opposition to the state. So in these many areas, people have developed a certain opposition to state approach to managing the water, natural resources in those areas, natural resources that are typically affected by climate or environmental disaster. And so when you're talking about response or policy addressing these issues, you have to also be conversant with the governance environment in which these policies are going to be implemented and the human resources or the human societal institutions in those areas. You can't assume that there is a void. You can't also assume that these people are in a certain headspace. You have to be cognizant of where these people are, who they trust, which institutions they go to for decisions, and how they typically approach these issues, what language they use, how they understand these issues. That's how the policy is able to enter into their governance space, also able to influence what we call their epistemology, which is how do we know what we know? What do we define as knowledge? What do we consider knowledge? Because just because you say something is climate change related doesn't necessarily mean that it becomes an emergency for people in rural areas. There's a way they understand climate. There's a way they see and observe climate. You have to be able to interface with how that jurisdiction perceives climate. And you have to be able to mobilize both interest, emotion, passion, motivation in the direction of that policy objective, leveraging what these people already know.
Yeah, I can say you said from what I get, you feel like communities don't really know much of what climate issues they're facing.
They do.
Yeah, they do.
Oh, they do. They just know it differently from the way it is articulated from a Western-centric global North language. So when we talk about climate, we usually use technocratic terms, things like carbon, average temperature change, and so on. But these things, if we are being honest with ourselves, these things mean very little on the ground. They are very good for, paper policies. They work well with models that you put in spreadsheets and you do calculations.
Yeah.
But in actual fact, they need to be translated further in order for them to have any real effect on action. So for instance, what matters on the ground when it comes to communities is planting season. When do we get the first rain? It's about yield, of crops. And when we talk about yield, these people are looking at bags of corn that they get from a typical hectare. How many kgs do we get from a typical hectare and so on. So all of these are gaps in interpretation and communication. And unless that gap is closed by policy engagement. It's very difficult for you to get people to, first of all, understand before they begin to take action with you. And so that consensus has to be built through, closing of that, what I call the epistemological gap.
So let's talk about the barriers that they face. I don't know that they definitely have some limitations that would hamper their sustainable and resilient practice. What are some of those limitations?
They need facilitation. So, a lot of these communities, because the cost of the climate impact has raised the cost of livability for them, it becomes an affordability challenge, because how do we not just address this impact sustainably, but how do we even feed on a day-to-day basis? So many of these communities live in that fragile band where any shift, any small changes, shocks in economic environment, it
affects them,
it takes them out of what they can actually even afford or survive on. And so external support is critical to these communities, not just to live sustainable, but even to survive. So plugging these communities into frameworks for external support is key. And it's not just an ethical thing. It's a practical thing, because this is pretty much what climate change response or climate action means on the ground. At the end of the day, it's really about helping actual communities that are facing impact. And whereas these are communities in the global south now, because we seem to be the first of the many communities that will become climate refugees in the future, this is where we begin to practice what we preach about climate adaptation and test all the ideas and theories we have about how we will respond when this becomes a more global, broader issue. If we fail at this point, then there is no guarantee that we will succeed when this becomes a bigger issue. If we are still obsessed with our spreadsheets, our models, that we do not see the harm right in front of our nose, this is just going to amplify and multiply. We think or we believe that we will be better prepared in the future, but this is the test bed now. This is the opportunity for us to test our response mechanisms. Now, the message from these communities is that it's not just deploying resources, to these communities. It's about connecting these communities to support in a way that is coherent with how they see the world, in a way that is respectful about their own knowledge systems, because this is how they've coped with their environment. They have centuries of relationships with this environmental, so for instance, if the river, if it's the sea, if it's, a forest, these communities know these forests. They've lived with these forests for thousands of years. They have embedded relationships with these communities. So rather than approaching the response as a colonial response where it's exploitative, we are trying to redefine the relationships that these people have with the natural resources that they have, that have supported their livelihoods and their communities for thousands of years. It's about how do we engage in a way that is harmonious, that is respectful of not just these environmental services, but also the people's relationships with these environmental resources, because it makes no sense to save the environment if you destroy or erase the people who are living on that environment. Then the entire goal of human livability within the planetary boundary is defeated, because if we save the earth, but every human dies or every human can't survive on the earth, then there is no point of climate action. Yes. So the climate action is actually focused on people, even though the environment becomes the means through which we, it's the context within which we make, human life worth living. But still, we must not lose sight of people. But these people are not just savages. They're not just people without intelligence without governance systems, we have to appreciate that these people come with history, with thousands and thousands of years of intelligence, governance systems, relational systems that have enabled them to cope and live with these natural and environmental systems for longer than science has even existed, and that these knowledge systems and these governance approaches need to be leveraged rather than erased or destroyed.
You've been listening to Amara Nwankpa tell us how we can not be climate refugees with our actions and how we treat the environment. We'll take a short break, and when we return, we'll know what policies are available for communities to leverage on. Stay tuned.
I want to give a shout out to Home TV. This has been spectacular. People here are doing an amazing work to continue this important discussion, conversation, and information. So I want you and everyone over there seeing us to go to the YouTube video, Home YouTube video, and continue engaging, learning, participating, commenting, liking, enjoying the channel so we can continue this collective space of learning. It's a collective learning space that we want to expand, not just here in the office, all over Nigeria and all over the world. So join.
Welcome back. You've been listening to Amara Nwankpa, who is a civic technology expert and a public policy expert as well. So thank you. Before we went on the break, you were sharing some barriers that community persons face. But now we would like to know what solutions are available to them. So how can they leverage how accessible are resources to rural communities that would help implement climate adaptation measures?
The very first thing is helping leverage the resources already within the communities themselves. Now, when you properly diagnose a governance problem, you can begin to leverage domestic resources to address those problems, not just in terms of money, but knowledge resources. So for instance, what do we know about this kind of problem? And what are the mechanisms that we have that can address this? And then, of course, that local knowledge becomes the base. So for instance, if you look at one example I normally give is, climate smart agriculture, like for instance, hydroponics. A lot of times when people hear that it's advanced technology and they think about, okay, you need to bring new skill sets, but 60% of the skill sets are plumbing and, electrical. And these are skills that are already available. The only thing is they have to be repurposed. And sometimes if you are able to break down what the challenge is and translate it into something that communities understand, you will identify already existing knowledges, already existing skill sets that can be mobilized in the direction of that problem. So the community becomes also part of their own solution. And of course, there are resources that are available at both the national, subnational, national, and international level. And then it's about facilitating access to those resources and working with communities to prioritize how access to those resources is managed. So for instance, it does appear that because of our poor co-planning with communities, most of the emergency response resources that either we have in store or we're able to mobilize is being spent reactively. It's being spent in addressing damage that has already occurred. Whereas if we were able to co-produce planning with these communities, we can spend a lot of these resources in advance to prevent that harm or to adapt to that harm or to react to that harm in advance. So it's a proactive response that might not be as expensive as a reactive response. So those are ways in which we can help mobilize resources or connect these communities to resources. But one of the things that I always say is co-govern resource management with the community. Because what happens is that process of co-ownership or leveraging the existing, contribution mechanisms, because every community in Nigeria does community development. They do contribution among themselves. If there is a transformer that is not working, they will normally contribute money among themselves, even call their children from, in town and abroad to say, look, help contribute. So there is a self-help culture already existing within communities. If you're able to leverage that, what happens is that the community is able to add its own resources, mobilize itself again to be able to ensure not just the completeness of the resources, but also the sustainability of whatever work that is done. But when the intervention is primarily state-led, top-down, and externally driven, it doesn't feel embedded as much in the community. So the community takes very little responsibility for its maintenance, its sustainability, and so on and so forth. And so most of the times it becomes reactive, it becomes one-stop clock kind of intervention, and it has no staying power. So that would be my response to that.
What partnerships do you think exist between the communities, the civil society actors, and the government?
Okay, so I would say that new partnerships need to be, and I think that we have to center communities in these partnerships. So I think a lot of the imaginations that we have about how to respond to climate change is not far off the mark. Some of the technologies can be successful, and some of the approaches can, but it's about centering the community. It's about putting the community first, and then letting the community knowledge and community experience lead. Community governance systems as well, because then the communities can tell you what will work and what wouldn't work, what would assist and what wouldn't assist. When you center the communities, you find that you begin to leverage new knowledge systems that are embedded, or what I would say customized to that environment. So most technologies they are generic, but you have to customize them. You have to adjust them in a way that fits into a certain social setting or a certain environment. That knowledge of how this water behaves, of how our land behaves, of how this tomato reacts, of all of that is indigenous knowledge that is sitting within our traditional knowledge systems. And you can't design for a system that you don't understand. So starting out from the community perspective to inform technology, to inform governance, to inform resource mobilization, that's the proper approach. And then that would then inform what technologies will work, what technologies wouldn't work. It reestablishes the jurisdiction of the community, the sovereignty of the community when it comes to systems that they already govern. For instance, many communities govern their food systems, their local markets, they govern their water systems, they govern so many aspects of life, including fishing. Where do we fish, where don't we fish, and so on. They're traditional methods for governing this. What you don't want to do is to engage in the kind of collaboration that erases these traditional sovereign methods. What you want to do is to validate, to recognize, and to appreciate the value of these knowledge systems, but also to complement, supplement, and facilitate them. And when you do that, then technology will find its place, processes will find its place, even additional resources will find their place within the context of what the community sees as their future.
So thank you very much. Do you have any other passing word that you really need to tell that is not being asked right now? This is the time.
Yeah, so I would say that, there's a global view on what addressing climate harm and climate impact is. But that global view is dominated by the global north. It might not necessarily be the view on the ground in many communities in the south. Many communities in the south have a different view of the future. They have a different vision of the future, of what a climate harmonious world would look like. And so it's important to incorporate that in our global conversation about shaping or responding to climate harm. Because what these communities see as a harmonious, livable climate future might require remediation. It might require reparation. It might require some degree of repair. But more importantly, it would require a recognition that they exist, that the things that they care about matter, that their knowledge systems are effective, that their governance systems are valid. And if those things are damaged somehow by climate response, then these communities, climate response has already harmed them. And then we are already destroying in advance something that we are claiming that the climate will destroy in the future. And so unless we are just to these communities, unless our definition and our conceptualization of a future incorporates their vision, their definition, their world views, then climate action itself is already killing them.
That was a very interesting put to stop. And in responding to climate harm in rural communities, one notion has been established. We should remove our ideas from capacity building to capacity sharing. I think that's one thing that I have picked so far from this, that communities do have the knowledge that we need to push the policies that they deserve. And we've come to the end of today's episode, because I know that if I leave Amara, we will have a bucket of knowledge to share. Thank you so very much for availing us with your time. And we do hope that when we come to you some other time, you'll be available. Do follow us on all our social media handles on EcoHomef. And remember to visit our website, www.homef.org. I remain your host, Kome Ojomo. Thank you.